feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the farm system.
Fellas, and the ladies. We have a lot of the ladies today. We're all going to jump in. Okay, so today, welcome back to another episode of the farm. All right, we got special guests, and also too, I'm just gonna slap the intro over to Taylor because I want Taylor. Listen, you plug this one up, so I'm gonna go ahead and give you the flow on this one. So go ahead.
All right. You guys, we've got a special guest on today. We have Kim Schwartz, a licensed therapist in the space of mental health. She's had a wide variety of experience over the years, and she's going to be a real treat for you today.
Love it. Okay, so first question: how you feeling?
How am I feeling?
Yeah, how you feeling? How you walking in?
I walked in nervous.
Yeah.
However,
We pushed through that though.
we pushed through it
pushed through
and feeling relaxed and just excited.
Yeah. I think on the same side of that, I was actually just interested. This is a personal note. As you've kind of, I feel like maybe you haven't recognized this. I was gonna say, I feel like when Taylor gave me the life update, I was like, good for her.
Hell
Like,
yeah.
yeah. You've been doing some cool things.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, take us through. Just a general, just walkthrough of like how you've gotten to where you are now. I mean, even in the short term, I know a lot of exciting things have happened in the last, I don't know, year and a half or so.
Right.
But also with that being said, there's a lot of work, obviously leading up to that and what built the passion, those things as well. So why don't you kind of just let everybody else know who you are, since, we've obviously brought you on because we feel like you're going to have so much value,
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So some of the things that have happened, yes, big transitions that have been going on. So what brought me to Vegas over 2 years ago was I was working with a dual diagnosis, so primarily substance use and mental health, of course,
Yeah.
treatment center.
Mm.
And I was in that space, loved it, love inpatient, love working with people who are just starting their addiction recovery journey, their mental health journey, healing journey.
Was that at, were you and Taylor working at the same facility at the time?
Yes, and that's
Okay.
actually how I met Taylor.
Oh, okay, that's right. Okay, I didn't know if she was the first. You guys were at the first facility, or Anyways, yeah, I just wanted to connect those dots for me in my head.
Yes,
Yeah.
and she outlasted me. She outlasted all of us, and we would have our lunches together. And so Taylor was really like my first real connection, my first friend here in
She's
Vegas.
a good friend. That's a good first friend, to be honest.
I'm
Yeah,
kidding. No,
yeah.
she's great.
For
Yeah.
sure, absolutely. So you obviously coming out here and doing those as well. What did you feel like passion wise? What brought you to just the field, like in general?
Yeah, just in general. So, I don't know. In high school, I just really noticed that I enjoyed just observing human behavior and just very curious why people do the things that they do. Like, why do they stand a certain way? Why do they talk the way that they do? Why do they, I don't know.
You're one of
just
those.
exist?
You're one of those people watchers in the mall, huh?
That was me.
That was you.
That was me.
I get it. I've taken part, so that makes a lot of sense. So you got really interested in just humans, from that same side. There's a lot of people that are interested in humans, but you went to a whole nother way. You got all the way to from the
I
clinical
did.
side. So yeah, connect that too from those high school, people watching, right? Some other people call those stalkers, but we're gonna go ahead and move past that.
Not I.
She's
Not I.
I'll take that one. I'll take that one.
You take that one too. No, but when you went from that, how did what made you want to go towards the clinical side? Because again, like it's a hard thing to do.
Right.
It's a challenging thing to take on. Other people's traumas and to work through these hardships that they've had in their lives, and also help them, and be part of that journey with them. It's a that's another step. Then,
Mhm.
it comes, something I kind of like to do as a hobby compared to this is what I want to do with my life. Help me understand why you made that jump.
I made the jump because the spaces that I was introduced to, it just didn't feel right to me. Working in research, just learning about the things wasn't exciting to me. When I was working in those research labs, I found myself jealous of the people that were on the floor talking with those participants, those people. And that's when I really pursued that. That's when it all started to click for me. I don't know, I had, I guess, like this insecurity that I didn't always know like the right thing to say when someone was going through something.
Yeah.
And that's when being a therapist, being a counselor for me really started to make sense, because it's not about the advice that you give when you're a therapist, counselor. It's about holding space. I'm just there. Like, I'm supposed to be there. Not supposed to, I am. I'm there for you
Yeah. That's really,
and with you.
no, I think that's a very, I want you to kind of unpack that a little bit more, because I think that's really insightful, because I think a lot of coaches, or I think that's a normal human response, right? When people are having, again, they're trying to be there for someone, and especially through hardships and things that are happening through people's lives. I feel like they, again, I know I felt that way, where I feel like, I need to say the right thing. What am I supposed to do in this moment? And those things. Help us like understand what you mean by that, like by hold space, being, kind of present. What does that separation look like?
Yeah. So oftentimes we think that we have to say the right thing, like, oh, it'll be okay, or go get him, like you'll do better next time, or it'll all work out. And it's not about the things that you say; it's about the things that you do. People typically aren't going to remember the things that you say. They're going to remember if you were there for them or not. Whether you answered that text, answered that phone call, showed up to that game, sat with them while they were going through something, instead of shutting you down, or encouraging, just being there.
Yeah.
That's all that we really need, is for someone to just be there with us, not make us do one thing or another. Well, we all need people to encourage us and motivate us, and those kinds of things. But there's just something really beautiful and really magical that happens when you're just really invited and allowed to just be you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, hopefully I did that when you first walked in.
Yeah.
Hopefully that was the space. But yeah, I think it's an interesting space, because I want to tie this into, it makes so much sense in my head, because I feel like everything merges together with how I look at just human beings. But I think on the same side of that, I think humans, we typically have we like to compartmentalize these different sections or areas of our lives.
Yeah.
And so, like I'm one way when I'm coaching, but I'm another way when I'm at home with my family, or I'm another way when, what those things are, right? And I think that coaches, commonly can kind of do that. And so I think on the same side of that, I wanted to connect that with coaches like around. And I think why, again, I thought this conversation would be so powerful for people to listen in on, is when I stopped doing that when I was younger, and like actually like matured into understanding that in all areas, and also especially coaching in those type of roles, the impact that coaches can be having on players and things like that as well, is that connection from the same side of that is literally what you were just talking about,
Right.
and how that leads into athlete, not only just performance, because I think when we look at athletic performance, we separate that from just humans walking through life and what we would call performance. We like to connect that with athleticism or some type of sport. But in reality, I think, I think there's obviously athletes are just humans. and
I would hope so.
Yeah, I would hope so. Yeah, they're not aliens.
They could be.
Yeah, I mean, that actually makes sense.
I don't
yeah.
know.
But I think on the same side of that, the conversation that we're having as well is it's part of what I would call like your coaching tool belt, right? Which is another aspect that, we coaches really need to dive into. I know in
Absolutely.
baseball, it's well underdeveloped, and it's not it's an area that's being more adopted, and it's been more adopted now than it's ever been. But it is an area that we're still like, again, I want to normalize these conversations.
Yeah.
Of what, again, there should be these conversations constantly all over the place. So speaking into that as well, I know one thing that a lot of people, I think, like I don't think I've ever said this. Tay, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think on a podcast that I've said this yet. But I've been seeing a therapist for a little over 2 months. And the same thing too, is one of the reasons I want to talk about that is I think something that's highly not talked about largely is that typically how society would view your like high producers or your whatever that would be, successful people.
Yeah.
Are
like a type A kind of person.
Yes, that like there's no way, right? Like those people don't go to therapy, or you only go to therapy when something is wrong, or there's a major trauma that is happening in your life, and that's the only reason. And I know obviously my experiences from being around Taylor, and also just again being in that space, that is so far from the truth in the opposite way. And so in any case, I wanted to throw that to you as well, just kind of open that up to normalize that, when I know that's so normal for you because that's your world, but someone that is not in that space has no idea, especially because so many of those type A's are hiding that they're going to therapy or that they're seeing someone or etc.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. There's still definitely that stigma that exists. I'd like to think that things really are shifting. Just us even having this conversation today and talking about it. And I think it's interesting how, certain clients that I talk to or other people, particularly my own clients, they'll say things like, "What? Kim, you have a therapist?" Absolutely. Like just to like you said, normalize that conversation. Yes, your therapists have therapists. I mean, at least I would hope so.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I'd recently heard that someone said that's a sign of a good therapist, like quote unquote, a good therapist has their own therapist.
Yeah.
The reasons why a lot of us are good at what we do is because we truly do understand in some way, shape, or form, either exactly or, like I said, some way, shape, or form. And
you believe in it, obviously, right? It's like why you would want to go to a therapist is it's because you obviously participate and you have your own, someone else that you pour into, and that
yeah. I never ask my clients to do anything that I wouldn't be personally willing to do or already are doing or have done. And those high achievers, I've observed that there's usually something that they could be overcompensating for. And as time goes on, if you're not unpacking it, like you said, then if there's a major shift that happens, then that could be very detrimental to those achievements.
No, that's literally a huge piece. Me and Taylor have talked about that before. Is literally what you said. Like one of the reasons I felt like was a fuel for me of like why I've achieved so many things was out of places, again, like I didn't realize how motivating my traumas were, right?
Absolutely.
Major motivators. They're major motivators. And again, like you said, right, as I started to remodel and heal from those things, well, now there's a shift in my motivations. And am I motivated? Like, and again, where are these rooted in good places? And I think what I struggled with as well, for example, we talked about this a couple podcasts ago, where I was talking about when you take in athletes like, let's say like Kobe Bryant, or you take in like Michael Jordan, and you listen to some of these guys talk, it gets so normalized in society that's like, oh, I want this Mamba mentality, or like they want these mentalities that these guys have. But also too, like you said, when you actually listen to them, I'm interested. And again, I don't know how many, just from your perspective, because I've listened to some of these high performers, right? Which you've had a lot of experience with these high performers, right? But I listen to some of these high performers talk, and when I used to listen to them, I would be like, wow, they're so dedicated. They're so X, Y, and Z. But now a lot of times when I listen to them talk, it's like I start hearing the trauma that's behind, right? Or the insecurity that's behind. Or, for example, I'll say this for to clarify that, like flesh that out, is like, there's certain like stories, like you'll hear like Kobe Bryant, for example, he'll say, I'll be in the gym and somebody would come in later, right? He would get up in the morning and let's say he's at the gym at 4 a.m. Somebody would come in at 5 a.m. and then he would stay until that person left so that he could prove and that person would know that he worked harder than them, right? And again, when you're a normal person's hearing that, they're like, wow, he's so this, right? But then when I listen to that, I'm like, okay, yes, I understand why you perceive it that way, but also there's an underlying reason there that that's not normal, right? That's not how.
Right.
And again, some people will be like, yeah, but that's why he's so elite. And I'm like, I agree. Like he is elite, but why is he elite?
Yeah.
And not necessarily like glorifying that there might be some underlying issues that are there that to talk about those things as well. But yeah, could you kind of open that up when it comes into maybe what's glorified maybe in like society from these like high achievers, and sometimes like we're glorifying some mental health issues that these people might have as well.
Yeah. When you were speaking about that, my brain went, who is he trying to prove that to? Is he trying to prove it to this stranger, or this person like X over here? That's on the surface level. That's what it seems like, or at least that's a story that we're telling ourselves or other people.
For sure.
But there's typically, almost always, there's this unconscious trying to prove themselves to someone else.
Yeah.
Whether it's in their past, it's typically going to be in your past.
Yeah.
Typically going to be some kind of caregiver, not always, not to bring up the whole childhood stuff. But
which is a big deal.
Yeah, and
if you want to run past, it is a big deal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We repeat those patterns. Our brain will continue to repeat things that didn't quite get that resolution that it very much needed.
Yeah.
And so we'll consciously or unconsciously do that.
Yeah. I think a big point and take away from the person. I know people have contrary views on him, but I think I was listening to Jordan Peterson talk about this specifically when he just was talking about, talking about traumas, and he's like, your brain, there's a fear that it was built, and then the reason that it holds on to that fear is because it believes it to still be true today. So if there's a past, a past hurt or something like that, and that really helped me with traumas and things that I'd worked through, even with my therapist, is like the fear that I had in those moments that were like crystal clear. Because one thing, and I'm sure again, obviously you can share this in much more detail, is I know for me and my experiences and just what I've learned as I've learned more about traumas and how our brains internalize or adapt to them, is like it's typically the traumas are attached to obviously very strong emotions, and also to it's kind of a red flag or way to identify these traumas or things that have happened in our lives. And I think Bianca, and correct me if I'm wrong too, Taylor, when she describes it as a trauma, is anything that changes the way that you look at yourself or how you perceive the world, right? How you perceive yourself or how you perceive the world, I think was her definition. And then I think also another telltale sign for me to identify some of these things were as well is like when I looked back, those moments were like crystal clear. All the senses came back. I could tell you what was on the TV. I could tell you what the room felt like.
Crazy, right?
I could feel like I'm still in that room when it was, 20 years ago or something like that. And I think on that same side of that, I kind of want to throw that back to you too, as well as when it comes to, I think we throw around the word like trauma. But from your perspective, because like, again, when Bianca said that to me about like, how you perceive, yourself or how you perceive the world, I think that also brought a lot of clarity on what a trauma actually was and how I could identify it.
Right. Yeah, I always explain trauma because, like you said, a lot of people can turn away from that and say, oh, well, I had a great childhood, this or that, or no, nothing like that ever happened to me. So it's kind of a two-parter for me. A long time ago, I heard it described as there's trauma with a capital T, and there's traumas that with a lowercase t, with a smaller t. And so your capital T is just going to be your major ones that you might think of.
Yeah.
But then you have those lowercase t's,
Yeah.
and those could just be very small, very little things,
Yeah.
maybe to a lot of people that are it seems insignificant, or generally it seems insignificant, but for you, it was coded as significant. That, and I always describe it as just stress. Like, I interchange the word trauma to anything that causes significant stress, or just a stressor. Like,
Yeah.
there's some things that are good stress. Like, we want to
Yeah.
have a certain level of stress,
For sure.
and just depending where we are, and what we're able to take on and handle, sometimes we're able to take on a lot of stress.
Yeah.
But other times, a very minor, seemingly minor thing just
Yeah.
seems like the biggest catastrophe in the world.
Yeah. And again, to give clarity and an example of that, like, for example, like the one that I would go back to a lot was, I had a baseball game, and I was trying to perform for my dad. And I hit like 2 home runs that day.
Wow.
And so I was like, yeah, that my dad didn't respond that way. So,
Okay.
so we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah.
So I got home, and my dad was watching a Giants game. I remember him sitting in the chair looking at the Giants game. I'm sitting on the bed next to him, and I'm like telling him how my game went. And I could tell you everything that's happened in the room. I could tell you his eye contact. I could tell you all these things. And I was probably 12, right? And also, I think it's also amazing, because the other side of this is, as I've healed more and more from this moment, because I'm going to kind of clarify that in a moment, is I'm losing details of that moment as I feel like I'm healing from it.
Interesting.
Right? And so, but when I go back to that moment, right, and I actually, went through this, because one of the main reasons I went to my therapist, before I kind of get into why that moment was so significant for me, was when I went to my therapist, and they, typically we have the conversation, well, why did you, like, it's the first time I've ever gone to therapy, right? And also no one in my family has ever gone to therapy. It would be,
I feel that.
yeah, it's not normalized at all.
Yeah. Same for me.
Yeah. Right. And so, because of that, on the same side, it's like, he's like, well, why did you choose to come to therapy? And I just, more so, it's like, well, I mean, I think on the same side of that, I'm very interested and I'm curious about myself, one, and my motivations. And also, two, I also know that who I am has gotten me to where I am today.
Absolutely.
But also at the same time, what is holding me back from where I want to go,
Yes.
and also how I want to interact and live my life. I know there's things there's chains, there's things that are confining me, that I keep running into these walls. And there's these reoccurring things that I see, these bigger patterns. And I have awareness that, again, like, I've read a lot of books on traumas. I read a lot of books on how our brains internalize these things. And also I talk to a lot of therapists on a continuous basis. I have, a best friend that's really involved, and, tells me, again, we have a lot of these conversations. And so, because of that, like, I was able to identify, like, these moments and these things that, again, if I wouldn't have done that work and wouldn't have that awareness, that I wouldn't have clarified them or classified them as
That's
traumas or
awesome.
things like that. Right.
I mean, it's not awesome, but
But
awesome at the same
At the
time.
same time. Yeah. And so when I, talked to him about that, I was like, hey, like, and also too, I understand that my business, and again, if you're a coach, like, your program can't grow bigger than you. And what I mean by that is, like, your leadership on the same side of that, like, if I don't grow, the people that I'm pouring into, on the same side of that, like, they're not that I'm their only factor that causes them the growth, but again, the same thing, if I'm leading them and I want us to go to a higher point, like, I got to continue to grow.
Absolutely.
And also normalize on the same side of that. How am I going to tell my player that they should go see therapy, go to therapy, and how important it is for their performance and all these things? And then, like I said, obviously I'm not taking those things on. So in any case, like, when I go back to this moment, like, because again, I think a lot of coaches or somebody might say, like, how does that moment, why does that affect your performance? Why would that, my childhood, why are we talking about my childhood right now? I'm struggling with X, right? And I want to be first testament to that, of testimony from that same side, is like, as I've healed through a lot of these things, my performance has skyrocketed in certain areas that I'm very aware of, that were really holding me back. And one of those things specifically, and the same thing is, like you said, is one of my biggest achiever, like why I became an achiever was because I was trying to perform for my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to make him proud, and I wanted him, and I had this idolization and these things with my dad. And I spent a large portion of my life to this point trying to achieve that. And I still catch myself at times, obviously slipping into those areas. I'm like, oh, but I'm just aware of it, more aware of it now. And so because of that, I can get distracted from what my true performance or mission or whatever that is,
Absolutely.
goal, because I'm trying. There's this, bigger, underlying subconscious drive that I'm trying to fulfill, or whatever, how I kind of process that. And it was getting me distracted and and I kept hitting ceilings, and I
Mhm.
couldn't get past certain areas of growth because I needed to go backwards so I could go forward.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, just to throw that in, I just wanted to connect that with an audience that, especially I think men in that same way, and especially just like you said, that comment of like, well, why are we talking about my childhood? Like I'm having a
Yeah.
problem now, And then
Right.
what does that have to do with any of that? Is that, again, I just wanted to put that story out there and normalize that. That again, when I went backwards, right, and we did go through these things, and I figured
Sure.
out for the last, and the relief and the weight that comes off of my shoulders, and the weight for you as a man that can
Beautiful.
come off of your shoulders,
Mhm.
by doing those things and taking those steps, and having those conversations that feel uncomfortable or vulnerable or X,
Right.
Y, and Z, how powerful that can be for what you actually want, and the things that you actually are trying, the father you want to be, the coach you want to be, the professional achievements or things that you might, or be chasing after, that they're all interconnected. Sorry, I know that was like a little tangent, but I felt like that was important. Me and Taylor talked about that, about on the same side of that I feel like in the space, a couple things that you said that triggered that is how not normal it is inside, especially I feel like inside of baseball.
Mhm.
And I feel like a lot of people would presume that I would not be going to therapy, or that there's something
Oh,
wrong
yeah. Gotcha.
if I'm going to therapy. And I think on the same spot of that, I wanted to point that out, that like, no, like me too. Like I go to therapy. Again, it's amazing. It's done amazing things for me and all those things. And I wanted to advocate that, throwing that back to you as well. Yeah.
You know what's so interesting about what you said is earlier you said that we tend to compartmentalize.
Yeah.
So something that I've learned is like the typical like male brain, man brain.
Mhm.
You all are really good at compartmentalizing, almost enviously. So there's like pros and cons to that, right? So there's a pro because you can you can shift from role to role to role,
Yeah.
and not really for the most part,
Mm.
let too much affect you.
Yeah.
But there's a con because those roles can be so, or certain thoughts and roles can be so divided,
Mm-hmm.
that certain areas fall short. I think
Yeah.
you understand what I'm saying.
100%.
But then you said that you've been able to make these connections
Mm-hmm.
and integrate
Yeah.
all of these things. So,
Mm-hmm.
are we compartmentalizing or are we integrating?
Yeah, no, she just clinically broke me down.
did.
I
did that.
Yeah, no, but I do think like I think, and again, to flesh out literally how I see it in my brain, is that there is a time and a place where, let's say I'm at work and something really frustrated me, right? And instead of me expressing, in a way that right now I can't in a healthy way express how I'm feeling,
Mhm.
maybe I need to go home and like I need a journal, and I need to talk to someone, and I need to do all those other things, right? I think that, like you're saying, like that can be obviously a major pro, right? Is like learning those skills of how to process those feelings that I'm having, and not just because again, I think what happens a lot when people are just purely compartmentalizing
Mhm.
is what they do is, Taylor describes it a lot. I love this analogy that she uses. It's like dirty laundry. Like you throw dirty laundry to the side, you throw it to the side, you throw it to the side, you throw
Mhm.
it to the side. But at some point, you just got a massive pile of dirty laundry that you haven't
Yes.
dealt with. And especially like, again, along with it, then it starts to leak into other areas of my life. So let's say I'm having professional frustrations that I'm not expressing to my partner, or I feel like I can't talk to anybody about, or because when I was younger, my dad told me I couldn't have any feelings and I needed to man up and I needed to, stop being a B and whatever X, Y, and Z.
Real things.
Yeah, these are things that, again, a lot of men have had these
Right.
experiences, or they need to push, hey, you need to man up and push these things to the side,
Yeah.
which there's some truth to that, of like within that, of in the sense of, hey, like right now, again, like it doesn't mean that I need to never go
Right.
address those feelings. But there is a thing where, example, like I get it from a sports standpoint. Let's say I'm in the middle of a game or something like that, right? There's a lot of things that are happening throughout my day, throughout my games, throughout practice, throughout whatever experience, at work. There's a lot of things that are happening, throughout, that I might need to look back on and unpack when I'm in a different setting or in a different thing. But I also think that literally what you're saying is like how I view it is, if we start to compartmentalize, let's say I keep all my bad things in the closet, right? There's this other room that I hide all my mess in, right? And I keep shoving things into that closet. Well, yeah, for a little while I can get away with it. And how big is my closet? Maybe I got a massive room that I'm throwing some of these things in. But at some point, right? Like at some point, some of us, I feel like, have a bigger closet, some of us have a smaller closet. But at some point, that capacity, like it's like, I always think of it like poison, right? It's like that poison like builds up. And then I start spewing that poison everywhere. And then I project it on the other people, and I hurt others, and, trauma causing trauma, hurt people. Like all those things start to do with that. And I think that that's the thing, is that there is a, I can't in the middle of my day, at every moment when I get frustrated, sit down with a therapist, right?
Right. It's unrealistic.
It's not realistic, right? But at the same time, it's also not realistic to not unpack those things either. And I think that that's how I visualize it. Have learned to visualize it in my head with those connections and those compartmentalizing. Is there's like a duality, like you were kind of describing that, with it, that I've learned to, integrate a little bit more.
I always say that, there's a time and a place. Like you said, when you're in the middle of a game, no, you can't just, hey, Taylor, I'm having a problem. Can you help me?
For sure.
We can't do that.
For sure.
I mean, I guess you could.
Yeah.
But
I'll have a little earpiece, buzzer in. I got it. For sure.
So in those moments, that's when we need to go back, and you said this word earlier, our tool belt or our toolbox.
Yeah.
And bring out a different kind of tool in that moment. And so we have like our quick go-to tools in those moments, but then we have talking to a therapist or journaling or going for a run or whatever those things look like to get those out, because that kind of energy, it lives in our body.
Yeah.
Whether we realize it or not, those aches and pains.
Yeah.
Those are signals to you that it's not just a physical thing.
Yeah.
Like our emotions can be stored physically too.
Well, and I think one of the great points, and I think as a man, like I think a big thing that I've come aware of, and I think it shows up, obviously, men, in the sense of, I think kind of I've learned more that typically how women show anger is usually different than how men express anger in general. Obviously that could be intermittent.
Yeah,
but
blanket statements.
Yeah, blanket statements in general. But I know I've started to realize that, again, my anger, frustration, all these other things typically show up for me as a secondary, it's typically a secondary emotion for me when I haven't been able, or I haven't unpacked other emotions, or I haven't unpacked other things, and that becomes the response of laundry that I haven't unpacked, and again, the poison that I now start spitting out with those things. And so I know for men in the same way with that, it's like if you are, and I know that this is for me, is like, it is like an alarm system for me, or like an awareness system for me, that when I'm starting to be, again, obviously easily angered, and it, to me, obviously, from more like a biblical lens of like not showing the like fruits of the spirit, right, in that same way, that like when I don't have self-control, when I'm not patient with people, when I'm not trying to help, I'm getting self-absorbed, it becomes I, like all these things start happening, that those like are alarm systems for me, that there's probably something underlying that I haven't dealt with, and even if I don't know what that is yet, that awareness or that alarm system says, hey, like I need to look closer. I need to go underneath the hood a little bit and figure out, what that is. And maybe, again, maybe that's with a friend. Maybe that's with my therapist. Maybe that's me journaling. Maybe that's, me, even just sitting and meditating and trying to feel, trying to feel something I've maybe suppressed or something like that, which is a skill set.
It
in its own,
very much is.
for sure.
I'm impressed right now.
Oh.
You're so self-aware, Joey.
No, sometimes.
Wow.
Sometimes. Don't give me too much credit, for sure. But yeah, no, I think that's a thing. And I was going to say that with, I know that with men, and I just want to speaking about that specifically with that is, I think that it's what has been normalized that like, oh, men are just typically, they get angry or they get frustrated, and that's normal. It's okay. It's normal to get angry and frustrated. And again, obviously there is like, it's okay to have feelings, but on the other side of that is, again, like, I think there's something deeper, that typically I know for me personally, of that being like a secondary emotion, that there's other things that I might be frustrated about or upset about, that I haven't been able to talk about or express. And I know that especially for a lot of men in general, where they've been told, the man up or these other things, they haven't even learned those skill sets of like, I can go home and journal and try to feel whatever emotions that I'm having or unpack it with a friend or have friends around me that are also in those awareness spaces and that can help me from their own mountain or viewpoint, that they can tell me what's going on and what they see from their side. But again, along with it, I know that a lot of people don't like that took me a lot of work to build that tool belt and that toolbox with a lot of really smart people that are a lot of really aware people around me to do, and also too mentors and books and all those other things. But I just wanted to bring that up too, that like, you don't need, one thing I say to a lot of people all the time is like, you don't need to live your life this way. Like, you don't need to live your life angry. You don't need to live your life resentful. You don't need to live like that. It might have become normal to you, but it doesn't mean that it needs to be your normal,
Yeah. So a couple of things that you said. So just responding to the last thing that you said, where you said that it doesn't have to be your normal. We will make excuses, for lack of a better word. Like, I've always been this way, or everyone in my family is like this. This is just how I was taught.
We called it the Cunha temper in my house. You like that one? Yeah. It got associated with my last name, that we were all just supposed to have a temper, a short temper, because it was in the Cunha.
So those things just reinforce exactly what you just said. And while that may be a thing, it doesn't have to be.
No.
It gets reinforced. And then so going back to when you were saying that anger can be a secondary emotion, so particularly with men, and it doesn't have to be men. You could have just been raised in a household, worked with a lot of women who also were raised this way. So, but with typically men and growing up, there's only two emotions that are okay to display. So you named one of them.
Yeah, I'm interested in the second one. Go ahead.
What do you think it is? If you had to guess.
I know, that's why I'm interested, because maybe it's bad because my household anger was good, was okay.
It's that. Oh wait, no, sorry.
Oh, well, I would just say like normal and like angry, like whatever.
Correct.
That is.
Yes. So content.
Okay.
And
That makes
angry.
sense. Got it.
Nothing else, because if you try to show anything else, it gets shut down. You get
100%.
called out. You get called names. You get punished in some way, shape, or form.
Yep.
You had said something earlier, but it also made me think that.
I also think it gets rewarded, right? Like, for example, like what I mean by that is like men, because we're like in a lot of situations where like, let's say a man gets a tone or angry or these things, like a lot of people will submit, right? And so there's I get what I want. When I get angry, I get what I want.
Right.
When I throw a tantrum, I get what I want. And so subconsciously, I feel like on the same side of that, like men a lot of times get rewarded when we again speak louder, or
Mhm.
some of these things that are like innate, like like call it like our our monkey brain, like that
Mhm.
same thing, those spaces, which I've heard from the opposite side. And again, obviously, again, men do these things as well. So I wanted to bring this up, but also predominantly what I've experienced and read about, where like if you're a lot of women, when they showcase anger and they express aggression or things like that,
Mhm.
a lot of times it gets expressed in different ways. Like for example, like reputation destruction, gossip, like like they you go down
More
those,
passive aggressive.
yeah, more
Or
passive aggressive,
passive.
or ways that they actually really do have leverage. Like let's say on the same side of that, like if you're in a partnership and you're really mad at your partner, you guys break up X, Y, and Z, and you go like do something with his best friend. It's like those are all
Like get
ways,
back behavior.
yeah, like get back, or like you hurt me, so I want to hurt you,
Right.
right? And so they just show up in different ways. And again, men typically, because it's rewarded and because it is a way that we have leverage or something like
Mhm.
that, is in those situations that not only are those other ways of expressing my emotions, again, disciplined, or not allowed to happen, but then I also, from a society standpoint, get rewarded um, with what I want when I throw these tantrums, when I
Mhm.
get what I want. And also too, when it becomes, especially like a man that is more bigger stature, physical, all these things, like
Sure.
it's almost amplified because they get what they want even more often because they
The
can.
intimidation.
Yeah, the
factor.
intimidation factor. Or I felt like, for example, I felt like I got away with a lot of things when I was younger, and this is a different direction. Same thing with like things that were rewarded that I had to gain awareness on. Um, is like I think generally, like I was like a little cute kid, right?
Okay.
And so I felt like people let me get away with things, like,
Yeah.
and they let me communicate certain ways, and they let me be angry, and they let me do these other things, like, oh, he's so cute, and da 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 da. But also too, like that led me astray in a lot of areas that I had to do a lot of healing in, because it was okay for me, but it's not
Gotcha.
okay in general. And I think with all of those things, like again, what forms kind of our personality or those other things can be off of rewards, obviously, and punishments, and
Right.
that kind of interactions.
Yeah. It's always better to, like, when we're shifting that into changing behavior. So now that we've recognized this, we've gained awareness of all these things, of how we've been how not, I guess, now unhelpful behavior has been rewarded and reinforced, and we realize that we're adults, we're getting older, those things aren't working for us. We may go back to those things that we were originally taught, like that punishment, that discipline.
Mm-hmm.
We even will use the word discipline. I just need to discipline myself.
Ooh.
Um, but really,
You just stepped on half the people's audience's toes right there with that one.
science, well, but really, reward is what changes behavior. So,
Yeah.
what are we doing to reinforce certain things?
Mhm.
So, you may be getting rewards when you're
Yeah.
disciplining yourself because you get better, you get stronger,
Mm-hmm.
so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, you just have to figure out what works for you. I can't tell you that, you need to celebrate every little win.
For sure.
Like we definitely need to have structure and discipline.
Yeah.
But just maybe look at it as a spectrum. We don't have to always just go to the worst.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think the other part too, I think that I wanted with as well is like commonly, like going back into the coaching side here, is one of the best ways you can help your players is to help yourself, right? And unpack a lot of these things too as well is I think it's very often people come into these conversations and I think that's a good spot, right? Like it's like, hey, I think it's a level of awareness to realize how you're affecting others or the impact you can have on others, positive or negative. But I also think on the other side of that, a lot of coaches can come into this area of, well, hey, I want to help my players, or I want to help my staff, or I want to help my family, or I want to, I want to show up, well, I think that's a tier low, but it's like, I want to do more for them, and help them get where they want to go, or X, Y, and Z. But I think a lot of times we can take that out as understanding like our role kind of in that way. And I think the same thing with that is like, if our player's struggling, with things, I always challenge myself with some coach somewhere could get that athlete to perform, right? And or for example, like some therapist somewhere could connect and unpack like what's going on. And so I always challenge on the same thing is like you said, right? It's like in the beginning, it's like you just having a passion of like watching humans, right? But then you also interact. You're like, man, like there's a way to connect with them and bridge that gap between where they are, and those things and some of those areas. But yeah, I mean, from your experience too, do you feel like it's normal? Because I think from my lens, I feel like it's normal that a lot of people generally are going to project or generally are going to point in like it's them. How I want to help, but like rather than like they're necessarily coming like their first foremost thing is like that they're the problem or that it's them, that it's typically I'm coming because my mom hurt me or my player won't do X.
Gotcha.
Or like that type of lens. Do you find that to be very normal, like from your lens, or again, I'm just kind of going from my own experiences there, but from you, like from that sense, what do you kind of see when people generally come in that way, and what's like typical and that your lens?
Yeah, it can definitely vary. Maybe someone who really doesn't understand or have that understanding, they will see it as like this external thing that's happening. This person is doing this thing, and that's causing me to have all of these problems. So if this person would just do this, then everything will work out.
Yeah.
But that's not always how it is. Sometimes there's things that we have to do. But then on the flip side of that, we may think that if we just, like myself, if I just change this one thing, then everything else will align. I mean, maybe, but it might not just be you. You have to take that like 50-50 approach while also recognizing that the only two things that you can control are your thoughts and your behaviors.
Yeah.
You can't control your emotions, but what you can do is you can change either the things that you're thinking or the things that you're doing to then influence those emotions. Now, if we go back to the two acceptable, if we're talking about men here, again, generally speaking, men.
Yeah. Keep me on track. I'll start drifting. Yeah. This is good.
Take a note. We got this.
Good.
If those two acceptable emotions, that content or anger.
Yeah.
If there's something, then we go back to anger is a secondary emotion, then we have to start recognizing those other emotions that are inside of us that, like you said, that we didn't get to develop because they were shut down so early on.
Yeah.
And that's where reaching out, whether that's reading books, whether that's listening to podcasts, whether that's watching YouTube videos, talking to a therapist, talking to other people who can help you identify those emotions, what those even are, and then how to feel them. The very thing that you were taught not to do.
And you know what blew my mind with that was, I had a close friend that was struggling with PTSD. And one of the things that their therapist had them do is they had like a worksheet, right? And like, let's say you say like sad, right? Well, that's like a, emotion that people like, they can identify with, like sad, angry, like these big emotions, right? But then on the chart, right, underneath sad, there's like all of these other layers of what, underlying emotions that, you wouldn't even, that started blowing my mind because again, along with that, it's like, I mean, maybe I tap into like 2 or 3 of those, but I'm like, man, I would never identify that emotion as X.
Absolutely.
Because I've never had, majority of the time, not had those conversations. And also too, I wasn't allowed, they weren't rewarded. They're, all those things like all together. And I thought that was just so interesting. When I saw that chart, I'm like, man, I would have never associated that emotion underneath anger or underneath, these other things. And just that chart, like alone, I was like, man, that just blew my mind. Let alone like, I felt like I've done a lot of work where I can feel a lot of my feelings now, but and then also too, when I saw the chart of like, okay, there's a lot more work for me to do in that area, but also too, how far I've come where I only knew 2 of those major emotions
Sure.
rather than, not only the big emotions, but all the underlying emotions that are underneath all of that as well. I think that's powerful as well. Cause I think, and again, for, be interesting for, cause I felt like that was big for me.
Mhm.
Could you kind of open up maybe there or tap from that side of kind of that with like those emotions? Because I think men right now are like, okay, well, what other emotions are there?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't understand. I don't, okay, sad, angry, content. Well, I'm not allowed to feel sad, but I'm aware of sadness. I have
Sure.
the things. But what other emotions are there? I don't understand why there's so much to unpack, right? Even though it sounds, yeah. But go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could have hurt, we could have disappointment.
Mhm.
So that right there, we could, on the surface level, we're expressing that in anger. So
Mhm.
yelling,
Mhm.
blaming. So there's jealousy,
Mhm.
right? That could come from, we could be expressing that in an angry kind of way. But then let's see, we have sadness.
Mhm.
We have,
Well, I was thinking through like too, like sorry, I
Go
kind of put
ahead.
you on the spot there, but I was thinking like the same thing, like of, you underneath those things, right? You got like, like grief, or you have, and again, it you're sad, but it's a specific type of sadness, and
Right.
and it's also a specific type of healing or things that might help in that area, and that's where I think it's also important as you were kind of going through that of um, identifying, what those things are, because you're just like, I'm sad. It's like, okay, um, well, about what? And then it's like, well, my grandmother just passed. Well, okay, well, that's a whole nother thing other than disappointment, right? Like you said,
Yeah.
of like, well, I didn't get the raise that I wanted, and I've been working really hard towards that, right? And like, obviously, how you unpack those are going to be very different. And also, the grieving process is, one of the big things that blew my mind with like grieving, for example. I think typically people associate grieving with like death, right? But grieving shows up a lot more often
Oh, yeah.
than which I know is
Oh,
normal
yeah.
for you. But like it kind of blew my mind when I started thinking about the same thing too. Is like how many. One thing I actually it was so interesting to listen to a mother talk about their son leaving to go to college, right? And like I
Mhm.
heard a therapist describe it as their grief is not so much about like loss of a person, but like they described it as like a role you play in somebody's life.
Mhm.
And so, for example, like let's say that your son goes away to college and you've been their whole life, you've been the caregiver, you've been there, all these things, and like how they call it like the empty nest syndrome or whatever it's
Right.
called, right? But like with that is I would have never identified that as for and it doesn't have to be for everybody, a blanket statement in some way that being like grieving a role that you played
Yeah.
in somebody's life. And again, if you're going to process those feelings, right, that empty nest syndrome, like um if you don't identify that as grief, right? Or and maybe it's not for you, but if it is that for
Sure.
you, it's gonna be very hard to unpack that. Um, and I would have again the same thing with that is like especially when you only most people identify grief with, death or, with that, and then. We don't generally, a lot of people don't process that very well. It could be a major trauma that people have in their lives that typically would change trajectories or could really rattle things up. Then that's when people might be a big T for you
Yeah.
there as well. But I was just thinking like things like that specifically too as well. That could be really hard. Is like, and I think kind of what's to the point like why I wanted to point that out is that we just think of these big emotions, but we rarely go into some of those sub emotions, which I think is uh, really important when it comes to like the healing process. At least is first identifying what's really going on. So you know,
Yeah, and it's interesting. So you just keep bringing up all these emotions that have lots of layers under there.
Yeah.
I mean, they all really do.
for sure.
But even with grief, they say that there's 5 stages of grief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I mean, now we know that they're not necessarily stages and they're not linear,
Yeah, yeah.
meaning that
You flip flop back and forth sometimes.
yes, you can move in and
Yeah.
out. Sometimes you might get stuck in
Or
one.
get triggered and it brings up a very specific stage
Yeah,
or something like that.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a interesting piece. Yeah, what do you think? What do you think for example? And I wanted to kind of give this too of like helping coaches with their tool belt. Players obviously too, right? They have a group of, typically young men or young women, right, that are going through a pretty transformational time in their lives, right? Even if you're youth or if you're college or even again, I deal with a lot too of like professional athletes. People think professional athletes are all of a sudden not humans or something. But on that same side, what would you say? Like, I know we talked about this a little bit prior, where I was saying like I had at one point put together like an essentials course for hitting coaches with youth athletes. Like, hey, I get it. Like, I could be nerd, biomechanics, like go into all these sciences, kinesiology, and skill acquisition, all these things, and we can get super in depth. But here's like, hey, if I could go back and I'm going to coach, like these 5 basic things that have nothing that like with that. I think of like what tool belt. Things that you think are just simple things that I think that maybe that coaches could be aware of or ways that they could help help their athletes or guide them through some of this processes or XYZ. Yeah, once you open it up.
Yeah. So when we are experiencing those big transitions like you were describing, college or transitioning more into the professional space with that, there is going to be a grieving process that happens. Anytime that we have a major shift, like you said, there is a certain level of grief that happens. We go through the anger, the bargaining, the depression, the acceptance, and we'll move in and out of those.
Yeah.
And so it could be really very helpful for coaches to recognize that, get familiar with. You could just Google 5 stages of grief.
Yeah.
Learn what they are. Some things that you could do that could be helpful when you are helping, coaches who are helping.
Yeah.
They could just hold space. They could be curious. They don't like we were talking about earlier. It's not about what you say. It's just about you being there and building that trust and making sure that your players have that confidence and that trust and rapport in each other. And you need that with your team. You need that with your coach. Absolutely. If you don't have that, then, how can you have faith, trust, and confidence that it'll get you to that championship, to that win?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. Like you talked about, I think sometimes people think when it comes to those things, one thing that we brought up, like right now, and again, if you're not aware, definitely go look into some of these statistics. Me and Taylor talk about it, and Bianca's been very adamant in this area that mental health and the space of sports has been pretty extreme in the last couple of years. I mean, in all mental health,
That's great.
and large in the sense
As
of
it should be.
yeah, and so it's been massive there, but also too along with it, there's been a substantial amount of suicides that have happened throughout COVID and again through some of these transitions and things that have been happening as well. And so one of the big major things that I think along with that is that I think because obviously like say it's like something like that where I think it makes people internalize. Let's say if it's they heard on another team that one of their players commits suicide and it becomes national news. I think there's this large pressure that coaches can feel like they need to be clinical, right? That they can help at all. And I don't think that I one of the things I was going to open that is like, that's why I love when you talk about the space and those things as well is like, hey, like at one point, there wasn't like, you go back far enough, there wasn't clinical anything on that side. And it started with it. Like what we're talking about is like, obviously there's a science, there's all these things behind it. Right. But there's also at its base root, it's community and having relationships.
Thank you.
Right.
Yes.
With somebody. And I think on the same side of that is like, I wanted to open that up, that same place is where we can get like scared, like how do I even have that conversation, right? Like you're talking about. I know that, for example, and especially in a lot of sports, there can be some really tough things, not only just these major transitions that you're talking about, but I don't know if how many people remember when they're listening to this podcast what it felt like to actually be 20. um
Oh,
but
geez.
yeah, oh
No.
geez. Is there's a lot of things that are happening, right? And
Yeah.
there's a lot of transition, and there's a lot of self-discovery, and there's a lot of um uh back and forth and indecision and confusion, and also too, like for example, I know a lot of times inside sport, which would be really hard, and I know there's certain sports that this is more predominant than others, but I know that I've talked to a lot of coaches too that have where maybe an athlete's struggling with their sexuality, and that is a lot of times can lead to some of these suicides and things, because coaches
Yeah.
don't know how to have that conversation. If they should be having that conversation, do they pass it off to somebody else? What do they, like there's a lot of confusion,
Yeah.
and also again, obviously within the political climates and all those other things too. What can I say? What am I allowed to say? What am I not allowed to say? And then I think along with that, it creates this massive void where these conversations don't happen.
Right.
And so I think the reason I was just opening that up is I think a great example of this, and I probably hyper up too much, but there's this coach over at LSU. She's one of their assistant coaches, and her name is Lindsay Leftwich. And she's like, I don't know how good of a coach I am, but I'm really good at loving our players. And
Aw.
and so one of the things I wanted just to point her out for is I think she's such a great example of what it looks like, of what I'm talking about, like in practicality when it comes into as a coach. It's not that it's always again head on. Maybe she's not the person that they're talking to about all these things, but again, along with that, there's also a lot of things, and it comes into like environmental, that I think that she really provides for her players. And one, it is a space to speak if they do want to talk, right?
I love that.
But also, with that being said, literally like what she said, I'm just really good at loving my players. And I think on that same side, it's also a place where if they don't want to talk and they want to just come and hit,
Mm-hmm.
great, then that's what
that.
she does with them. If it's hey, can we go and like it's a barbecue, or it could have nothing to do with sport, or again, on the same side of that, maybe they're struggling with many things and they want to talk about one thing, which is I know for her, and especially LSU's program in general, they have a large I guess would say foundation in faith. Like they, again, the same side of that, they have a big group of what's the group called? I think it's called FCA, right? Yeah, FCA. So they have like a large group of their team like goes just Christian athletes, and they endorse that and those things. Now, don't, again, that doesn't have to be obviously with the go, but my point is like these relationships that she has with these players. I think one thing that we run past all the time is, and I think especially for men, and the compartmentalizing as a coach is, well, I could be their coach, I can't be their friend, or I could be a coach.
I see what you're
I
saying.
can't connect with them in this way because
Yeah.
I'm crossing over a boundary here, right? And again, obviously there is lines, there is things that we have to
Sure.
put in place. But also, with that being said, I think sometimes it can come very like so distant and so disconnected. I can't
Yeah.
tell you how many coaches that I felt, um, again, like there's coaches I forgot because we never connected, and I never, I played for them, but we never had those relationships. Um, and again, there's a healthy, those healthy spaces. And I think one of those things, going back to that original point of, it doesn't need to be clinical, is Lindsay is anything but clinical. But at the same time, she's such an amazing resource for her players because of her mindset, and also too, like how she shows up for them. And so, I just kind of wanted to open that as well, as like I think that a lot of times those conversations aren't happening because of all of these walls that have been put in place between you and the athlete. That some of them need to be there, but also two other ones have been put in place because we haven't had the real conversations that we need to have, or we don't know how to navigate. Which is, I mean, just the whole point of conversation in the first place is figuring out how to navigate.
Yeah, I think I always say it's totally okay to when you're when you're having difficult conversations, or nervous to have them, it's totally okay to tell that person, hey, I'm not even sure how to say this.
Mhm.
I am scared. I am nervous. I am worried
Mhm.
about whatever,
Yeah.
talking about this. But I do think that it's important. Like, that would be a good way to start that.
Yeah.
And you said something else, just showing up as yourself
Mhm.
for coaches. Just I use that a lot in my own practice. Is, again, it's not always about, in fact, if you mess up, that is what makes you human.
Mhm.
You're giving permission for those others around you to
Yeah.
also be human.
100%.
If you're perfectly imperfect,
Yeah.
people love that. If you're authentic and if you're just you, I mean, don't go out there, hurting people by
Sure.
being you.
Yeah.
There's certain boundaries in place.
Mhm.
As long as you're not hurting yourself and hurting others, then,
It's a place. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things, for example, like my sophomore year in college, middle of the season, my dad dies, right? And my coaches at the time, again, along with it, I would say to that point, we had a very relationship switch of what happened. I remember sitting in the hallway and my mom calling me and like, hey, like, where are you at? And I'm like, at, sit in the hallway about to go to practice. She's like, like, she asked me like where my girlfriend was at the time or this thing. And I'm like, I'm out of practice. Like, what's up? Like, like you're being weird. Like, what's up? And like the day before, sorry, 2 weeks before that, my dad had a surgery where there was like a 50% survival rate. He survived the surgery. Everything was going well, all the
Yeah.
things. But then she called me that like when they took him off the coma, medically induced coma, like he didn't wake up. And so basically they talked about they didn't have enough blood pressure in his brain at the time when he had surgery, and all these things, complications happened, and that he was going to die. And so along with that, I had because I think about this, right, is with my coaches, right, that especially them at the time, especially looking back now, like they had their own trumps, they're humans,
Sure.
right? They have their own, like, they were the same way that man up, XYZ, all these things, and they held space for me.
It's beautiful.
I went in their office and like I cried. I fumbled it out what was going on, and those other things. They asked me again what I needed. Um, uh, they let me confine and just
Perfect.
talk. I then also too they gave me a lot of freedom in the sense of I flew home. Um, uh, or actually before that, a couple weeks prior to that, before my dad had the surgery, they already had made space for me to fly home, see my dad, spend time with him, and then came back when we're in the middle of season, right? And then I flew into a city where they picked me up from the airport in our
Wow.
SUV, right? So that I could still go to the games, and like I still started. He asked me, he's like, "Do you want to play?" And I'm like, "Absolutely, I want to play."
Yeah.
And so like they again gave me the freedom to do either those things and made space. I know, for example, another example of this, especially, I'm using this as examples, like when I was in high school, my senior year, my dad was still battling this before I went to college, and it was really affecting me, and I started acting out, behavioral, and all these things started popping up, and also my school load at the time was pretty heavy, and so they figured out a way, like my school. I don't know if he was a psychologist or anyways at the time I sat down with him and he we talked about that I had looked at my load that I was having at the time, and I took 2 math classes to start the year. Well, they figured out within the curriculum, well, since I took 2 math classes, that counted as a full year of math. So my second
Yay.
part of the year, I had now openings for 2 classes, and they
Yes.
lightened my load dramatically.
Wow.
And again, things like that. What I mean is like figuring out specifically, maybe as a coach of fleshing that out, is like there's this other coach that I really admire. He's in Florida. He always says, Randy Sullivan. He always says, know your athlete. And he always takes that to so many different angles. But one of the things, same thing with that, is if you've already done also a lot of relationships of getting to know your athlete, and like their schedule, and what, the things that they're committed to and what that looks like, if it's FCA, if it's, where they're serving, if it's, maybe all those other things. Like, I feel like you, just like a good friend would, where you could serve them and where you could help, and what might be adding more to their load. And what would mean a lot to them. And maybe it's, for me, I would say specifically as well with how I do things is I don't necessarily need like grand gestures. Like for me, help is like, bringing me food in the middle of the day because I'll forget, right? Like I just won't eat. It could be, again, someone helping me with my dishes at the house. Simple task, right? Because on the same time, those are things that I won't prioritize or I'll throw to the side.
Yeah.
And those things mean a lot more to me than big grand gestures. Because to me, that is more of a grand gesture, that it's more impactful to me, but to somebody else might not feel that way. And that's why I think it's like specifically to like athlete to athlete or person to person. That if you've also done your work prior, it's a lot easier to help when tragedy or these things come up of like how you can show up for that individual athlete or, human in general.
Right. And you made me think of something else that I also like to tell my clients. So, but I'm going to have you guess.
Okay.
How, percentage wise,
Yeah.
What percentage of communication do you think is verbal?
Ooh. Verbal.
From like 0 to 100%. Where does...
I've read some books, but I don't remember specifically. But
Just give me a number.
I'm gonna
throw out a
say-
number.
I'm going to throw out 10.
What?
I'm going to throw out.
No one has ever guessed that on the first. Really?
Well,
Oh my
I've
God.
read some books. Because and correct me if I'm wrong on this. You let me know. But isn't something like a massive part of a communication is visual, right? It's like it's almost a predominant communication method, like body language, micro expressions,
Yes.
things like that,
Yes.
etc.
Yeah. So 90% of our communication is going to be nonverbal.
Got it.
So.
Yes.
I cannot
for the good
believe
guys.
it.
I knew
Joey.
in my head that he was going to get it.
That's awful. You
This
should have
is-
warned
this is a
me.
stumper, but
No.
he's going to get it.
No, well, and the only reason, just to be fair, the only reason I've looked into that,
Okay.
right, specifically, again, I do study a lot
Gotcha.
of things with the brain because when
Oh.
we talk about like patterning, right, obviously patterns and the things and like how
Yes.
the brain works, it goes in a lot of these things. And when I'm coaching, for example, if I'm verbally like assaulting them with all of these words, and it's like,
Yeah.
okay, like there's so many of my athletes that want like, Taylor actually took, I think it was Taylor or somebody took one of our athletes, or maybe it was somebody else took one of our athletes to our pro guys to the airport, and they had mentioned like, man, it's so cool when someone can demonstrate it in front of you, and you can see the difference between two
Yes.
different movements, right?
Yeah.
And so for specifically, like I think about that with the brain. On that same side of like how much, again, there's so many other ways to communicate. And then also more in tuned also, I think also, I'm just throwing out this for husbands, on the same thing, like you get into like love languages and all these other things, right? Like there's so much communication, like again, physical touch, gifts, like all those things of quality time, right? You start going into like all these different areas where you can communicate how you feel, which again, for men is hard. There's it could be, we're also communicating when we're not talking.
Yes.
And that is also a form of communication of like, I need space, or I don't want to talk, or, whatever that might be, giving off a boundary, or, specifically in the situation. But that's, just to be fair, that's the only reason I really know. It's just like, again, there's so much overlap with like athletes, and I have to be able to pick up on when they don't, there's a lot of times too, again, generally just humans, like, especially in performance settings, especially because I train primarily men, that they won't verbally communicate with me.
Yeah.
And so I have to pick up on like what they're feeling, when they're
Yeah.
frustrated, what emotions they're having, even if they don't know what emotion they're having. And also too, as leadership, like within our own team, right? Like if someone's struggling with something, or something's heavy on their heart, or where they're at, I just have to pick up on those things a lot more if I want to be able to lead them to a higher capacity. So that's just something I prioritize. So
That's
again,
awesome.
I get why, in general, I would have never guessed that without, reading and doing a lot of those things.
Yeah. And, that's a skill set. is to be able to identify, hearing a certain tone
Mhm.
in a voice, in someone's voice, or the way that their body shifts.
Yeah.
Are you having a conversation and sudden, like, with open body language,
For sure.
like arms open, legs uncrossed,
Yeah.
face to face,
What are you
and
talking about right now?
suddenly something gets said,
For sure.
and then now, you're closed off and
Yeah.
your arms are crossed
Yeah.
and your shoulders are hunched over.
Yeah.
And again, we're saying blanket statements.
For sure.
This can definitely vary depending on, neurodivergence.
There she
and-
is. I'm waiting for the nerd to come out.
Yes.
100%.
Neurodivergence and, culture
Mm.
and, just general anxiety things too.
Yeah, I love the when I stepped into micro expressions. I think it's so interesting because they'll do that with like when they're doing interviews, right? Or there's these people now that are, who knows if they're experts, but like on TikTok, it's like a real big thing right now too, where let's say somebody's on trial and you can't talk to the defendant or something like that, and they'll go look at their micro expressions of like what their face does, or if they're telling lies or they're not telling lies, and like the ways that we express motions through these, like what our eyes do, and what, like for example, when I connected with it originally because people would say, like, when you meet someone, it's like you can just tell in the eyes. You can just tell in the eyes.
I feel like that's so fake.
Yeah, and so, but I do think, for example, I do really pick up on, I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if they're micro expressions, but like you said, like just obviously bigger body languages for sure. Because I would say the same thing. For example, I've done that just when me and you have been talking. I pick up on your body language, right? When we're having interviews, right? I can feel, again, the same thing. I can pick up like when you've relaxed, right? And like we're talking and having a conversation, or if you feel like I'm interrogating you, right? You have a different posture, right? Of what that looks like. And I'm about, while that becomes like largely subconscious for me now, I'm still like aware of it. I'm like, oh yeah, I did pick up when, exactly like how you're sitting in a chair or something like that. And also too, by talking to so many different people. But I think it's a large thing as a skill set as a coach. And that's why I bring that up so much too, is typically, and I think this comes into like patterns or falling into these cycles, is we're running in cycles because of how I call it, like, again, like your movements or how you act, right, is a mapping of how your brain, perceives that stimulus, or how it wants to respond to that stimulus. And so I think on the same side of that, if we continue to view it the same way, we keep running in these same circles over and over and over again, and keep running and, feel like I'm chasing my tail or whatever that is. And so I think, like on that same side, that when we can alter, like give an alternative viewpoint or perspective, how dramatically that can shift and unlock obviously major things, which I think therapists really help with, is changing perspective. And the last thing I was going to add here is another way of looking at therapy that someone shared that I really liked, is that it's like, I'm not here to fix your problems, right? The therapist was like, I'm not here to fix your problems. Instead, it's like you're on a mountain and I'm on a mountain. That's why I said the mountain statement earlier. You're on a mountain and I'm on a mountain, and I'm just telling you what I see from my mountain that might really be able to help you. And so from that, you got to fix your own mountain. You're like, what's going on? I can't even get over there, right? Like I can't even get over there, right? But I can, we can talk through things. I can give you perspective. Again, I can help you with, these tools of things that, and things I've developed on the same side of that. And maybe again, on the same side, how much I could help you, like, again, maybe I'm a helpful resource for you, maybe to a certain degree, and then I got to hand you off to somebody else's perspective because I can't see it all either. Maybe
That's
somebody
true.
on that side
Very true.
and that mountain over there could help you the most on what's going on over there. And so I think on the same side of that is like with athletes, I even started calling, I think you might find this interesting, is when I started working with athletes when they were hitting, I started calling it swing therapy.
Oh yeah.
And the reason I brought that up is because more often than not, like let's say somebody just does drills, right, that I've given them. Let's say you give them a work, that another therapist uses the same worksheet that you use.
Yeah.
But it's not the worksheet. right?
No,
Yeah, and
it's not the tool itself.
yeah, yeah, and I think that, for example, when we give away the drills and like, okay, you're gonna get some of the results for
Mhm.
sure, but how I'm speaking with them and how I'm seeing their body language and how I'm seeing them move and how their body's interpreting what I'm talking to them about and their
Mhm.
perspective and all these things, it's more therapeutic from getting them to not like I have to remap how their brain is, perceiving, movement or the problem,
Yeah.
right? And then they move differently, right? And they act differently.
Yes.
So it's very like I see a lot of correlations, obviously, in the sense of just general actions of how people go about it, and that's why I started calling it more swing therapy than me being like I'm not a
Gotcha.
swing coach. I don't. We don't just do drills.
Yeah.
I'm very involved in their personal lives. Again, I take on a lot of those things. I want to know, what's going on, what they're struggling with. Especially, I tell them all the time, I'm more so like a doctor or a therapist in the same way, right?
Mhm.
That when things are going bad, that is what I could be a great resource for you rather
Absolutely.
than you hiding your face from me or disappearing and not texting me or you've been struggling. It's like, that's when I want to help, that's what I
Yes.
want. That's what
That's
I'm
where
here
growth happens.
for sure.
Avoiding is so easy.
Yeah.
But it actually, we think that by avoiding things, that it'll just go away.
Dirty
But
laundry.
like, yeah, the dirty laundry.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. In fact, even though it's uncomfortable, those are the times that we need to turn to people that we do trust,
Mhm.
like a coach.
Yeah.
That's a very special relationship.
Yeah.
And
Well, it can be.
it can be.
It can be for sure.
But the things that you're describing, that you're able to modify
Mhm.
certain things just by picking up on body language and certain cues,
Mhm.
I think that's great.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the main reasons too that I wanted to have these conversations is like, again, I think it's very easy for us to compartmentalize like, oh, like one of the ways I look at it is like nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have all these sciences that are around nature, right? We got geology and we got biology and we break, we compartmentalize like all these things of trying to understand nature, but we got to understand that like nature doesn't know these sciences. We develop sciences to understand nature. And so when I say that when I say that for example with an athlete, like it's not their body is it isn't biomechanics, sports psychology, your therapist, your
Mm-hmm.
all these, again kinesiology, skill acquisition, like these are like the human doesn't know the sciences like when I say it that or
Mm-mm.
like how your body, it's all of these things are at play at the same time, right?
Yes.
And so when I look into all these things, the reason that I like having these conversations, and again, a lot of times these conversations don't end up happening, is when I see those correlations are over to like a particular field, is like, man, like that skill set is dramatic in my ability to be able to get an athlete to perform.
Yes.
And so if we don't have those conversations, and if I only go, well, you talk to him about those
Mm-hmm.
things, I'm going to stay in my lane and you stay in your lane. And that's kind of, again, while that is a step,
Sure.
at least they're in the conversation, right? And that's part of the thing that really at one point, and the best holistic thing is all of this interwebbing. And yes, we have specialists and
Mm-hmm.
yes, all those other things too. But like, there's a book. I wonder if you read this book too. There's a book. It's called Range. You read that book?
Mm-mm.
So Range is a book about basically being multidisciplinary
Okay.
and how it's a skill set in
Yes.
itself to in a lot of these different areas. They go into some of those things. And so, like for example, a lot of times I'll have these crazy, maybe innovative, maybe
Okay.
I don't know if everybody would describe it that way, but like I'll have these crazy insights, but it's very seldom from actually being in the space of baseball. I'll
Mhm.
go outside the space. Something will inspire me dramatically, and I'll see
Love
the
it.
correlation between the two. And then I'll take those pieces and want to pull them back into baseball.
Mm-hmm.
And that typically challenges and becomes innovative for the space,
Uh-huh.
even though it might not be anywhere innovative for you,
Yeah.
because this is normal inside your field. But for again, for a coach, like we talked about in the beginning, right? Like it's innovative inside the space of baseball. Some of these conversations that we're having right now, right? Just in the same sense of well, why should I need to know anything about therapy? And why should I even look into, for example, like I have right now, which is, again, I don't know, this is a good thing. This is probably some of my childhood stuff, right? Me still being an achiever. I don't know. Who knows? But it's like I've read, like we've talked about, like I've read a good amount of books on like therapy, trauma, all these things. Yeah, some of those things obviously are going to impact me personally. But also with that being said, some of those big motivators are, I want my players to have best results as quick as possible. All those other things as well. And I think that that's a piece that I've looked into, or I've read in these other areas. Because again, the same thing too. If we keep having that same perspective and running in the same cycle over and over and over again, we're not going to get anywhere, right? And I like to leave, especially if I'm really struggling with something specific that I can't like figure out. I'll stop working on it. Usually go to somebody that might be more inclined to that
That's
specific
great.
niche, and then come back.
Yeah. And we need to do that. So you just described insanity.
Thanks for sure.
So
Let's start the podcast with that
Honestly,
one-liner right
makes
there.
total sense to me. Yeah.
I like
Checks
that.
out.
That actually makes a lot of sense now we're talking about it.
yeah, insanity is doing the same thing
Yeah.
over and over, expecting different results.
Yeah.
And if we want something different, we have to do something different.
Mhm.
So like bringing in things from outside of baseball and bringing it in. And while from the inside, that may look like insanity, like
Yeah.
those within,
Mhm.
you're challenging those things. You're challenging yourself, you're challenging your players, you're challenging other coaches, you're challenging just the limitations of baseball and the field itself. And
Break me down. I saw you circle something. What did I say?
we
Oh, and before we move on to
Yeah.
literally to your point, on my window written in my office, it says nothing changes if nothing changes.
that's fine.
And that's something that is like important like statement to me. And I like, again, along with that is just a reminder, like, again, nothing changes if nothing changes. Like,
Right.
I do need and another one of my a powerful quote for me too is like the plan is everything, the plan is nothing. And I say that all the time, as well as like I have a plan, right? We go into that circle, right? But let's say I've looped here and it's like, this isn't working, right? And instead of just doing it over and over again, or again projecting and saying, oh well, that athlete's just not a good competitor, or he doesn't know what it's like to do this, and he doesn't listen, and he's not coachable, and all those other things too. I go back to that other statement of
Yeah.
some coach somewhere could get this guy to
Yeah.
perform. So I need to figure out, and if I can either find a coach that can help me with that, or again, somebody outside the field that can help me with that, or a technology that can help me with that, then let's figure that out.
Wait, you don't know it all?
Oh,
really?
well, I mean, if you talk to the right person, you might say that I do. You know what I'm saying? Like in a bad way, like, oh, I got things to know it all. But no, there's definitely in that same space. That one of the reasons, and I guess we're just leading into my bumper stickers, is the other thing is I'll say is like I'd rather look dumb today than be dumb tomorrow, right? Which is like the same thing. I'd rather everybody in the room know I don't know something today, but that's also too why I learn so rapidly, is because I don't care. Like it again, I don't want to be in the crowd, the one not asking that question, or not having that conversation, or I might say something that's wrong, but like again, we put too much weight in being right. And that's why I can speak. Sometimes people confuse my confidence in sharing information with, oh, like he thinks he's right, rather than me being like, no, I just don't care if I'm wrong. And that's another place. Like if I'm wrong, okay, well, like let's talk about it, right? And what am I wrong about? And like, oh, that's really interesting, blah blah blah, and I'll move on. But I think a lot of times that gets confused, because typically the only people that talk with confidence, right, are the ones that think that they're right, rather than me being like, I'm just okay if I'm wrong. Right. And that's, I heard another thing about confidence the other day that I really pulled to, is like, confidence isn't, I know that they'll love me, right? It's, I'll be okay if they don't. And I think that was like a big, like, that one hit her. But when I heard that, like, that was shifting for me, right, of like that definition, because sometimes, of course, like we can all fiddle with the line of confidence and arrogance and what that actually looks like and those things. And I've definitely have narcissistic tendencies, and I fell into these things, and we all do, and these things of awareness. And also too, I've talked about this before, is when you are have been put on platforms in some right, and you can hear a lot of this noise, good or bad. Everybody's telling you you're the greatest, and everybody's telling you you're the worst, right? And like obviously at different times you're going to hear more of one than the other. And where you are, you're probably going to hear more than one than the other, even though they might be saying the same amount. But again, along with that is, again, Gary Vee talks about this a lot, of not holding too much weight for either.
Mm-hmm.
And I think on that same side of like having that space where that was a clear understanding for me within confidence, is like why they can get misconstrued is like, hey, I'm coming into this meeting with confidence, not because I know that you'll love me, right? But that I'll be okay if you don't. And that's why I'm confident. It's a different, I know that my confidence is not rooted in what you think of me, or that you love my presentation, or that you love my, product, or you love whatever I'm presenting or service that I'm presenting, or X, Y, and Z. And again, that isn't always like, again, even though that hits a heart thing with me, it doesn't mean I always feel that way, right? But it's a bumper sticker or a slogan, mantra, something like that I can go back to, a word that I can go back to, that can recenter me when I start to slip out of that, right? Where I start to, again, like I say, for a trigger for me from my past of I'm trying to perform for somebody, or I want them to feel this way about me. And I can, when I start slipping away from that, and I can have that awareness to go back to those things and say like, hey, like, okay, let's say that they said that you were the worst coach ever. Like, would you really, again, are you the worst coach ever? Or like, on the same side of that, are you supposed to be someone that never makes mistakes? Is that actually true? Is it not okay? Again, do I have permission to suck?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that helps me a lot on the same side of that. It's like, hey, like, for example, I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent. Is this one really helped me as well? Is when I started looking at, sometimes I started getting to this place of like, let's say people would coin me as like an expert or a guru or whatever, right, in our space. And so with that, I started listening to these things, right?
Yeah.
But with that, you think it'd be a good thing in some ways, but there's an expectation that now comes on to those labels, right? And so it was like I took myself permission away from making mistakes, and from maybe I told a hitter to do something and it was wrong, and what those things were, and that started putting an enormous amount of pressure on me. But then I had this realization, like, let's say you take the leading expert in the world on like knee surgeries, right? It isn't that he never makes a mistake on a knee. He makes them less often. And also too, on the same side of that, he might be the leading expert in the world, and he's most likely to perform some of the hastiest or the most aggressive type surgeries, and like he has this innovative thing that he does, and X, Y, and Z. So then I started telling clients too, I hope you're not coming here because you think I'm going to fix all your problems, right? Or that again, and again from my side of like that I'm Jesus himself, and that I know every answer and everything, but instead that like right now, yeah, I might be, maybe the most equipped to help you in this area, possibly. But on the same side of that, you finding rest in, hey, out of everybody like in the world right now, I'm with one of the top knee surgeons in the world. And if anybody could do it, it's this guy. But at the same time, again, I don't got magical dust. I can't tap your knee and all of a sudden you're healed. Right. And that again, like, what is leading knee surgeon today, 20 years from now will be normalized, and everybody will have this understanding for this. And so that obviously took an enormous amount, of pressure off of me, in those same ways, is like looking at it from those other perspectives and not putting all that weight. And that's why I again, also like that mountain analogy, the same thing too, is like, hey, I'm just over here helping you with some perspective that I see, skill sets and healings and things that I've had as well.
That's what makes you, from what I'm hearing, so great at what you do. Is and it's a similar lens that I operate from. I don't promise anything, but just coming to a space like unknowing, like knowing what you do know, and having learned and being willing to learn more. Because once we've labeled ourselves as an expert, okay, then we're putting just kind of like this set thing on ourselves, like this ceiling. Now there's nowhere more to grow and to go. And that's how you continue to grow, is by
Mhm.
recognizing, okay, yeah, I know things. I don't know everything,
No.
and
Yeah,
there's gaps in my knowledge.
for sure.
And I'm willing to, ask other people
Hmm.
or even do my own research
Yeah.
into filling those gaps.
No, and that's what I would say. Thinking too is like I think it's a perception of what people perceive an expert to be. In my opinion, like you're only an expert if you're only an expert when I've been around these experts around in any area in any field, right, that I've kind of interacted with, is that is the mindset,
Mm-hmm.
is that on the same side, the reason that they are quote unquote an expert is because of those mindsets like that are placed around that it has less to do, that has less to do necessarily with knowing everything, right, and more to do with the mindset behind learning, right,
Mm-hmm.
and more behind like, hey, like I've learned these things, like let me like I wouldn't mind sharing them with you.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that I know everything, but that's also, I think that's what drives me the most, is on that same side of that, is like I'm constantly, every single year I think about this when I do taxes,
Oh.
is she's like, oh, don't
It's
trigger
that time of year
trigger
too.
trigger
Yeah.
word. But when I do taxes every year, I document how much I have invested in education every year, and that becomes a big thing. And it's not always like, books isn't a way to,
Right.
but again, it might be courses, it might be,
Mm-hmm.
conversations, it might be all these other things that go into it. And I think on the same side of that is, I continue on the same side of that, of knowing that there's so many things that I don't know, and there's so many things, with it that I continue to grow into. But I think, like you're saying, is like on the same side of note of just tying that back into coaches, is that a lot of coaches on that same side is, hey, you do know things, but also too, again, it's just impossible to know every field. That's why there's niches and experts. For
Mhm.
example, there's a knee specialist because all he thinks about is knees. There's an
Sounds
ankle
awful.
specialist, right? What'd you say?
So it sounds awful.
Yeah, all they think about is ankles, hands, faces, all these things, right? And at one point, you just had general doctors that were across the board, and they had, orthopedics, they handled it, X, Y, and Z, right? But now you have like specialists. Like again, when I broke my
Mhm.
hand, like I had a hand specialist that he is so amazing at making sure your hand is back functional after you have a major injury. And like, again, like typically performance or sports athletes will go to him to have them fix their hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's these niche areas that you're gonna have these experts in, because like because they do focus on one narrow thing, that they're gonna be really good in that one area.
We can't know everything.
No.
We can't know all, be all.
Gosh dog it,
And,
you know?
you having that humility and being vulnerable enough to say it,
Yeah.
to me,
Mm,
to all the people listening,
yeah.
that right there,
Mm.
continues to prove that you're a learner,
Yeah.
and that you're willing to learn not only for yourself,
Mm.
but for others. So that way you learn from the things that didn't go as well,
Yeah.
as you hoped, and
Yeah.
then other people can, you're normalizing that for other people.
Mhm.
They can find community in that and
Mhm.
validation in that, whether they have done them, are doing them, or in the future could be
Yeah.
doing them.
And too, I would say sometimes, right? And what I mean by that is there's obviously times when I'm not being a learner and I have to reset that mindset. And I
Yeah,
start to become sticky in certain areas.
humility.
Yeah, and I think also there's moments that a lot of coaches don't have these conversations. I told myself that I need to start talking about this more. Is that I think a lot of people too, when they think about, when I like work with athletes, or the same thing like you as a therapist in your role as well, is that I'm 100% confident all the time in what I do, which is like, again, you're like, there's no, yeah,
No.
absolutely not, right? And
Yeah.
I think for example, like I'm sure you do the same thing, but like I'll work with an athlete and I'll review the session, right? And I'll go through, Darrell knows this, I'll sit in his office and go through every swing, right? And what we did and how we did and how I could have been better. Oh man, we shouldn't have transitioned to that. I was a little quick. It was a little aggressive. That progressed too quick. I, overloaded them. They know things like that and how I could do those things better. And then also too, like, again, like the tones I was using and like the music I was playing in the room and like all these things that go into
Lots of components.
yeah, all these components. And then also too, in the macro, I might even view something and going, man, like I really got away from this type of philosophy, or I really got locked in on this one like aspect. I think it's a healthy. I was reading a book about this too, which I think is contrary. The reason I'm bringing it up is typically it can be contrary that a lot of times, again, this expert space or whatever that is, these high performers that they're also not just highly critical, but also too like they're very like they're not only critical, but like they're always questioning, right? Like, okay, what am I missing? You know, and that type of like, and that's very common. Like, I guess when they did this massive study about these like high performers, is that typically they're, and again, I'm sure some of that's also tied back to insecurities and things like that within trauma, but also too, I think it's also there's a healthy characteristic of humility that comes into that. Of if I believe that I got everything figured out and I've arrived and I've crossed the line and all these other things, and for me that's a scary place because I feel like it's all downhill from here. Rather than on the same side of that, and especially with the thoughts of abundance and me being rooted in God in that same way, there's never a depth of knowledge or, again, I'm going to die not knowing plenty of things. And so it doesn't matter if I was a constant learner and every second of every day try to learn. It's like there's too much to learn, and there's too much that hasn't even been not discovered that we're learning as well. And then the other place that I always go to too is like, I've been wrong every step of the way. So why would I assume today that I'm not wrong about anything? It's silly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been silly, right? And
Well-
don't get me wrong. Along with that, like I've been right about things too.
Yeah.
But it's one thing for me. I realize that is like, again, giving myself permission is like, hey, like you've been missing things the whole time, right? And now all of a sudden today you think that you've seen all the things. Where I give myself permission, and I tell my athletes that too. It's like, hey, I guarantee you, I'm gonna tell you something today that I'm wrong about. And when I'm also too, what I want you to have trust and faith and those things within me is that when I discover, and every day I'm trying to figure out what I'm wrong about so I can be less wrong tomorrow, right? But I'm gonna come to you on the same side of that, and if I've been wrong with something, I'm gonna talk to you about that, and I'm gonna say, hey, I know we've been doing this, but I actually been thinking about it, and I don't know if this is really gonna work, and this is why, and this is what I think I was wrong about, and let's try this instead. Again, that gives permission both ways, where I'm not selling a magical pixie dust that I know, we're having an experience, and I'm doing my best and you're doing your best. And we're trying to create, the most beautiful, and so is and I think the scary part that people can fall into is, they start to think, and it's like the lie that, well, no one else is having to deal with any of this. It's like everybody else is doing their best too, with the same, like with these tough circumstances, with overcoming adversity. None of us are going to be perfect. No, there isn't the opponent that you've put out there that is perfect, that doesn't struggle, that has the perfect coach, that has the perfect magical dust. Like that's not it. And yes, obviously there's therapists, there's coaches, there's people within better, maybe better environments for that that fit them, that could be helping. Yes, for sure. But the lie that there's this perfect place, that we can put in our heads is obviously can cause a lot of bad things.
Well, if everything's perfect, then how do you do anything different?
Yeah.
And you said that we're all doing our best to a certain extent. Yes. Sometimes we're telling ourselves that, and it's not true.
For sure.
But when we really are honest with ourselves, when we're not, being our best, then that's we just need to be honest with ourselves, and then that's where growth can also happen by doing something different. And now we're just gonna come full circle with that, and we have a choice there. We can either ignore that and avoid that, and just keep doing the same thing over and over and saying, "Yep, well, I'm doing my best," but are we?
Yeah. That's good.
Well, one thing I'm going to throw
ahead.
myself in the conversation here
Throw,
too.
throw it in there, Tay.
Well, one thing that you mentioned a couple times and we've circled through it is that one, you're not afraid to reach out to other resources for help and guidance, which I think something that a lot of our coaches just don't do because of pride and ego.
Mhm.
But another thing too, like, all of us here know, like, we can't help the world, we can't save the world.
Yeah.
So it's important to know all the resources that you have around you. And one of the things I do want to talk about as we near the end of our time with
Yeah.
Kim is, some of the resources that Kim you offer via telehealth that can reach, state to state to state.
Mhm.
But some of these resources that, again, people can utilize from afar before we let ourselves go.
For sure. Yeah. Go ahead. Crack it open.
Well, yes. So if you or someone that you know would like to work with me,
Mhm.
I am seeing individuals
Mhm.
via telehealth, so sessions over video. My website is kindredjadesolutions.com.
We'll put it in the
And
show notes for y'all.
you can reach out to me through there. And my email address is Kim at kindredjadesolutions.com.
Love that.
If you have any
Yeah.
questions, I would love to connect. And as we've talked about, I'm a lifelong learner. So let's learn some things together.
Yeah. No, love that. And I think too, I think we've talked about this, Taylor and I have talked about this as well, is like a continued education. For example, I think we talked about that as well, that I think Bianca was the first one that we ever had on twice, right? And we might have had her on three times now. She was I
Wow.
think she was the first one we either had twice or three times, and definitely I think I almost unequivocally, I think I brought up during that episode that she was the first female that was ever on the podcast
Yeah.
when we originally had her.
Yeah.
But also on that same note, the reason that with that, so you got to be prepared. Is I'm gonna have Taylor tap you on the shoulder. I mean, we're gonna keep.
Yeah.
Oh
we're gonna
my
keep-
Yeah.
God.
have a
Look,
conversation.
Wow.
if you know me, you know I got all the resources.
You do.
I know
The
I can't
resource
help
guru.
everybody, but
Yeah.
I guarantee you,
Yeah.
I know someone
That's-
who can.
That's why.
True.
I'll
Well,
get you to the right place.
Well, that's why I was laughing when you said, everybody in here knows that we can't save the world. I'm like, Tay, that's your thing. Like that's the thing you've grown through. Okay, she was trying to save everybody.
Made
You
it
know
a
what I'm saying?
mission to
Yeah,
find
we-
every resource. What you need, I got you.
For sure.
Literally.
For sure, so good. But no, yeah, and again, along with that, like definitely again appreciate you coming on it, because again I do want to normalize, and that's why even with Bianca we've had her on so many times, is with that is like normalizing those conversations. And there's no way, obviously, in any setting, again, me, just like you couldn't, if we talked to somebody for one session, that the value that can be provided, and also different perspectives and things that we learn in questions, I'm sure people that will reach out and things that you're going to continue to, as the same way I'm sure a whole bunch of people on the same side of that, I hope, even on that same, and I know that you have that same heart, is, hey, like, even if you don't, like, I say this with, like, as a hitting coach too as well, it's like when people reach out to me, it's like, I get it, like, maybe you can't get with me, maybe you can't be here in Vegas, maybe you can't again remote train with us, or what that looks like, but also too normalizing the conversation of like, hey, like, there is resources in your area, there is also too resources that we talk about, like
Absolutely.
telehealth and all those things that like people don't even know are available, that, like, for example, like my therapist, Taylor's therapist, like that's what we do, is we work with them remotely through, again, I go home and have a session on my computer and sit down in the comfort of my own home, right, and have these conversations week in and week out, and again, like, those can be such powerful resources for people that they don't even know exist, because they're thinking about they might have this archaic I'm saying, it's like, well, I got to go to the shrink's office and
lay on
and,
the
you know,
couch.
yeah, and also
and
too,
they're
I got to
gonna-
have this major
yeah.
trauma that happened in my life, or what are we going to even talk about? Am I going to tell them that what and then
Are they gonna judge me?
100%. Are they going to push this on me? Are they going to push, I know for, I was just talking to a therapist the other day, and she was like, man, like, it's even hard for me because, like, let's say, they think that I'm going to push faith on them, or, push God on them, or some of these other things. And, and again, I think that breaking down a lot of those walls and having those things of saying, hey, like, not only these are great resources, but breaking down those lies that are holding you back from like where you're trying to get, and the conversations that you need to have are huge. So again, also the resources and hopefully I can, you know, from God also to push those things back to you too, is like the impact that, even though in small moments, and again along with that, like just where you've come, and also a short period of time of personal success, but also the impact, and one of the things I bring up is some of us have an opportunity, an amazing opportunity, to maybe on the same side of that, help one person in our life, and how beautiful that is in
Right.
itself, of to be a resource. And it could have been, again, for example, you know, I've had, obviously, not obviously, that was ridiculous, that I've had the opportunity where, like, again, like I've had, you know, friends that were, you know, best friends that were really close to me, that have struggled with suicide and those things, and they've come to me, right, in those areas, and I've had an opportunity and was part of that healing journey with them as well, and like how beautiful that is, right? But also too, like when someone's dedicated their life into the
Yeah.
things of helping, of again, like what that does not only for community but also the world, and the healing that that brings, rather than us all running around spitting poison at one another, or not having the clinical sides of understanding what's really going on, and we're not, you know, our triggers aren't, we're not running around spitting poison at each other, from our own traumas, and actually processing things. And with that is how much of a resource that is. So yes, thank you for coming on the podcast, but
Thanks
from
for
a
having
deep,
me.
but
I
from
loved it.
but from a deeper thank you is also to like what you're putting into the world, and also to the energy that you're putting back in, and where you're dedicating your life and your passions into, I think is just amazing. Because again, like I said, some of us have the blessing of helping one person. You do this day in and day out, and you know, pour into so many people, and just thanking you from a world.
I
creative
appreciate
perspective as
that.
well. So,
Wow.
yeah, thank
That was
you.
very
Thank you.
heartfelt.
No, yeah, thank you so much for jumping on. I'm sure it won't be our last conversation, and all of that. But yeah, it's been awesome.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much.
You gonna pray us out, or
Yes, thank
gonna-
you for the reminder. I always pray us out.
Let's
It's
do
it's a thing. Okay. All right, dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for our time that we shared here, God, and I just ask that you just open up the ears and hearts of everybody that was listening, and to hear what they needed to hear and what you wanted to say to them, and the ways that you walked through us and spoke through us, and we want to see the world like you do, God, and we're just so thankful that you continue to offer us perspectives, and how beautiful it is that you needed billions and billions of people to represent your personality, and all the ways that you love us, and all the different ways that you can show love for us. So just so thankful for those things, and these opportunities, and these experiences, and we ask that you continue to pour into us, and that you continue to open these doors and experiences. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And may all of our coaches out there make friends with a therapist.
Yes. Amen to that. Amen to that. Last note I'll say before we close out is, again, with that, and from a therapist, like you said, like a lot of therapists having therapists, or it should be having that, is, again, being a coach is not an easy thing. And there's a lot of things that come along with that. And I just want to like encourage coaches in that same way. Like, you're pouring into a lot of people. And again, you're taking on a lot of things,
Yeah.
let alone being a father at home, let alone,
Right.
all the other things that come along with it. So, yeah, you becoming, and reaching out, and getting yourself a therapist, I think is, it's been huge for me, and I think it would be a great resource for everybody as well. So I just wanted to say that before we wrap up, but until next time, Farm System out.